God is saying, I'm about to pay you back sevenfold. There is a peculiar way God speaks when he is about to do something far larger than we expect. He does not shout. He does not rush. Often, he whispers into the long corridors of our waiting, into the very places where disappointment once echoed loudest. You have felt those corridors. You have walked them at night, carrying questions heavier than answers, replaying prayers that seem to rise upward only to fall back upon your own heart. And yet it is precisely there, in the quiet arithmetic of loss and patience, that God begins to speak of repayment, not in small measures, not in careful balances, but in a language that startles the human mind. To say that God repays is already difficult for us to grasp, because we are trained by the world to believe that loss is final and injustice permanent. The world teaches us to keep score with bitterness, to protect ourselves by lowering our expectations, and to call wisdom what is often only resignation. But God is not bound by the economy of the wounded soul. He does not merely return what was taken. He multiplies it, transforms it, and returns it bearing his signature. When he says sevenfold, he is not speaking in exaggeration, nor is he indulging in poetry for comfort's sake. He is revealing something about his nature, that restoration is never a simple reversal, but an elevation. You see, the losses that have marked your life were not invisible to him. The time you gave and never got credit for, the love you poured out and watched go unreturned, the integrity that cost you opportunities while others prospered through compromise, none of it slipped past his attention. We often imagine God as watching the grand events of history while missing the quiet injustices of individual lives. But this is a failure of imagination, not of theology. God attends closely to the small stories. He counts tears not because he is sentimental, but because he is just. Justice, however, unfolds differently in the hands of God than in the courts of men. Human justice aims to settle accounts. Divine justice aims to heal what was broken by the loss itself. That is why God does not simply restore you to who you were before the wound. He brings you into someone deeper, steadier, and more capable of joy than the person who first suffered. The repayment is not only external, it is internal. The sevenfold touches your character as much as your circumstances. Perhaps this is why the waiting has been so long. We often assume delay is denial, but more often delay is preparation. A soul that has not been stretched cannot carry abundance without spilling it. God enlarges us by letting us endure seasons that feel empty. He trains us to recognize his voice even when it contradicts our experience. And when he finally speaks repayment, it is not merely compensation, it is confirmation. Confirmation that he was present all along, that nothing was wasted, that even the silence had purpose. Consider how many times you were tempted to quit. How many moments you almost surrendered your hope, not because you stopped believing in God, but because you stopped believing he would act for you. That is the quiet danger of prolonged waiting. It erodes expectation before it destroys faith. Yet God allows this tension, because what he is about to give you cannot rest on fragile hope. It must be anchored in trust refined by endurance. When God says he will repay sevenfold, he is not negotiating. He is declaring. He is asserting his authority over time itself. Time, which seemed to steal from you, is suddenly revealed as his servant. What you thought was lost to years is now Gath, arid into a single moment of restoration. And in that moment, you will realize that the years were not stolen, they were invested. This is where human logic fails us. We cannot understand how delay can become gain, or how suffering can be converted into authority. But God has always worked this way. He allows the seed to disappear into the ground before he allows the harvest to appear. The disappearance feels like loss until the multiplication begins, and it always begins unseen. There is also something deeply humbling about sevenfold repayment. It removes our ability to boast in endurance alone. If God only returned what we lost, we might claim we earned it by surviving, but when he multiplies it beyond proportion, we are forced to acknowledge grace. Grace not as a vague kindness, but as a deliberate, overwhelming act of generosity. The sevenfold is God's way of saying, This was never about what you deserved. It was about who I am. And yet, this promise is not given to soothe impatience. It is given to strengthen obedience. Many abandon their post just before repayment, because obedience without visible reward begins to feel foolish. The world laughs at those who continue to do right when it no longer seems practical. But God is not impressed by practicality divorced from faithfulness. He honors those who remain aligned with His will, even when the alignment costs them something tangible. Think of the moments you chose integrity when compromise would have been easier, the times you forgave when resentment would have been justified, the seasons you remained faithful while others moved ahead through shortcuts. These choices did not delay your blessing, they defined it. God does not repay faithlessness with abundance, no matter how skilled it appears. He repays faithfulness, even when it looks inefficient by worldly standards. Sevenfold also speaks to reversal, not only restoration but visibility. What was taken in secret is repaid in a way that cannot be ignored. God does not always repay quietly. Sometimes He repays publicly, not to shame others, but to vindicate the principle that righteousness is not wasted. When the harvest arrives, it carries the memory of the seed. Those who once questioned your obedience will quietly reconsider their conclusions. But let us be honest, the thought of repayment can awaken fear as well as hope. What if we have misunderstood the promise? What if the sevenfold looks different than we imagined? God is careful here. He does not bind Himself to our definitions of abundance. He binds Himself to our ultimate good. Sometimes the sevenfold arrives not as a single dramatic event, but as a sequence of restorations that reshape your life so thoroughly that you eventually realize you are living in an answer you once begged for. There is a maturity required to receive this kind of blessing. Immature hearts demand immediate proof. Mature hearts recognize patterns. They begin to notice doors opening without strain, or replacing resistance, peace settling where anxiety once ruled. The sevenfold often begins subtly, like light creeping into a dark room before the sun fully rises. Only later do we realize that the night has ended. And perhaps the most astonishing part of all is this: God's repayment does not erase memory. You will remember the pain, but the memory will no longer wound you. Instead, it will give weight to your gratitude and authority to your testimony. You will speak not as one who read about restoration, but as one who walked through loss and lived to see God rewrite the outcome. This is why the enemy fights hardest in the final stretch of waiting. Discouragement intensifies when destiny draws near. Doubt becomes louder when fulfillment approaches. It is not cruelty, it is strategy. If you abandon hope now, you may never see the repayment that was already set in motion. God's promises do not expire, but our willingness to stand can waver. So when God says, "I am about to pay you B," Acts sevenfold, He is not merely speaking about possessions, opportunities, or recognition. He is speaking about wholeness, about restoring laughter where silence ruled, about giving you strength that does not depend on circumstances, about allowing you to bless others from a place of overflow rather than survival. You may not see it yet. In fact, it may look like nothing is changing at all, but that is often the final illusion before the breakthrough. The ground remains still just before the shoot breaks through the soil. And when it does not ask permission from the darkness it displaces, it simply grows. Hold then to the promise not as a desperate wish, but as a settled truth. Let it steady your decisions, temper your reactions, and anchor your obedience. The God who allowed the loss has not forgotten the ledger. He is not slow, He is precise, and even now, while you are still counting what was taken, He is preparing to return it in a form so multiplied, so transformed, that you will one day look back on this season and realize that what felt like delay was actually the careful alignment of timing, purpose, and grace, and that the first signs of repayment were already appearing in ways so quiet you almost missed them, in the renewed strength of your spirit, in the unexpected peace that began to replace your restlessness, in the doors that started to open without force, and in the subtle but undeniable shift where what once resisted you began to yield, and where you started to sense that the long night of endurance was giving way to a dawn that would not merely restore what was lost, but would carry with it a depth, a richness, and an authority that could only have been forged through the very waiting you once prayed would end. And yet, even as the first rays of that dawn appear, the mind of man struggles to comprehend the magnitude of what is coming. We have been trained to measure return in human terms, by time, by quantity, by comparison with others. God's economy operates on a higher plane, one where the multiplication is not just in quantity but in quality. The sevenfold repayment does not simply match the loss, it transcends it, it refines it, it elevates the soul to a vantage point from which the very trials that seemed unbearable can be seen as instruments of divine artistry. The wounds that once caused shame now serve as reminders of perseverance. The moments of doubt that seemed like failure now testify to endurance. Every trial becomes a part of the fabric of the blessing, woven so intricately that the past cannot be separated from the present without diminishing the fullness of the gift. Consider the principle of seed time and harvest. Every act of patience, every demonstration of faith, every small obedience is a seed cast into the fertile ground of God's providence. To the naked eye, many of these seeds seem insignificant. The world would ask, what is the worth of one quiet act of integrity, one patient prayer, one refusal to succumb to anger or fear? Yet in God's hands a single seed holds the potential to produce not merely one crop, but a harvest so abundant it cannot be counted. It is no accident, therefore, that God promises sevenfold. For what seems like a simple repayment to human reasoning is, in reality, an overflowing manifestation of His sovereign creativity and perfect timing. He multiplies because He knows that ordinary human expectations are always too small to contain the extraordinary realities He is prepared to release. There is also a paradox here, one that the human heart struggles to embrace. The promise of sevenfold repayment is both comforting and demanding. Comforting because it assures us that our endurance and faith have not gone unnoticed, demanding because it calls for a response worthy of the blessing. The heart that has endured without bitterness is the vessel capable of receiving abundance. The hands that have given freely are prepared to hold what is returned. God's multiplication does not merely it transforms. It demands that we stretch, that we expand, that we embrace a capacity for joy, influence, and generosity that we might not yet recognize in ourselves. And so, there is preparation even in the moments when life seems paused. The waiting is not absence but formation. Character, wisdom, discernment. These are cultivated not in the sunlight of immediate success, but in the shadowed valleys of patience. The Spirit works silently in these valleys, shaping thoughts, redirecting desires, refining motives. It is often in the mundane, the repetitive, the unnoticed moments of faithfulness that the soul is being readied to receive what surpasses all expectation. The sevenfold return is therefore not merely a reaction to past suffering, but a culmination of spiritual formation, a reward that encompasses both the external and internal growth of a life aligned with divine will. Furthermore, God's repayment is never arbitrary. It is purposeful, tailored to the unique journey of individual. He knows not only what was lost, but what is needed to advance destiny. The multiplication is therefore precise. It fills voids that were left empty by injustice or misfortune. It restores courage where fear had lodged. It brings clarity to confusion, joy to mourning, and opportunity to seasons that once felt barren. The return is measured not by human sentiment, but by divine wisdom, and therein lies the beauty of its perfection. What we thought we wanted may not match what we truly need, and the sevenfold repayment ensures that the gift we receive aligns with the fullness of God's vision for our lives. Imagine for a moment the kind of patience required to walk through this season, to endure with hope yet without sight, to maintain integrity even when unnoticed, to persist in love when it seems unreciprocated. These are not small demands. They test the heart, mind, and spirit in ways that ordinary circumstances cannot. Yet it is precisely through this endurance that soul becomes capable of containing abundance. The sevenfold does not simply augment what was lost, it elevates the recipient to a higher plane of readiness. God multiplies not for spectacle, but for preparedness, so that the blessings cannot be wasted and the person cannot be overwhelmed. And consider the relational dimension of this repayment. Often our losses are entangled with the actions or inactions of others. A betrayal, a misunderstanding, a withheld opportunity. These involve more than circumstance, they involve other human hearts. God's multiplication, then, does not merely restore equity in material terms. It restores dignity, honor, and influence. It creates a scenario where the recipient can walk into a place of prominence, integrity, and authority, not by human calculation, but by divine design. Others may have sought to diminish, delay, or derail, yet God's sevenfold assures that the response will be proportionate not to human measure, but to the principle of righteousness itself. It is a vindication without vindictiveness, a reclamation without resentment, a triumph that uplifts the soul more than it diminishes anyone else. We must also understand the spiritual dimension of multiplication. What God restores is never solely external. He restores vision, faith, understanding, and purpose. He restores the ability to see the good in life, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. He restores spiritual clarity, allowing the recipient to discern his will with increasing sensitivity. This is part of the sevenfold principle, the multiplication of capacity as well as blessing. When God multiplies, He multiplies not only what we hold in our hands, but what we hold in our heart, mind, and spirit. The repayment becomes a comprehensive renewal, touching every corner of life, so that the recipient is not only replenished, but equipped to steward the abundance wisely and joyfully. And there is inevitably a public dimension to such repayment. Human nature, limited eye, vision, often assumes that blessings are private affairs. Yet God's restoration frequently manifests in ways that others notice, precisely to demonstrate that righteousness is neither hidden nor forgotten. There is a visible vindication embedded in the divine multiplication, one that testifies to the principles of justice, faithfulness, and the enduring power of God's promises. Those who doubted, questioned, or derided your integrity will find themselves witnesses to the reality that divine timing surpasses human judgment. This public dimension does not seek human applause, but serves as a confirmation that God's methods are perfect and His timing impeccable. And so, the faithful heart learns to interpret signs differently. What once seemed like waiting now reveals itself as preparation. What once seemed like absence is understood as quiet multiplication. The subtle shifts in favor, the gentle alignment of circumstances, the soft opening of doors that had seemed sealed, all are indica, tours that God's sevenfold is moving even before the overt manifestation appears. Patience becomes not merely an endurance strategy, but a lens through which we perceive the ongoing work of God, a lens that illuminates the hidden currents of blessing that flow beneath the surface of ordinary life. At this juncture, we must address the temptation to quantify or predict the sevenfold. The human desire for precision, for measurement, for control is natural, yet it cannot encompass divine action. Sevenfold in this context is both literal and symbolic. It communicates completeness, abundance, and perfection. It conveys a multiplication that surpasses human expectation, yet the exact expression of that multiplication is known fully only to God. Attempting to constrain it within human formulas diminishes the awe and wonder inherent in divine blessing. We are called to trust, to receive, to rejoice, and to prepare, not to dictate. In this humility, we find readiness. In this surrender, we fly. ND alignment with the magnitude of what is coming. Moreover, the sevenfold repayment encompasses more than material or relational restoration. It is restorative in character, vision, and mission. The person who receives this multiplication is not only replenished, but transformed. Past disappointments become testimony. Past hardships become wisdom. Past sacrifices become credentials for stewardship. God's multiplication prepares not only a life of abundance, but a life capable of multiplying blessing further. One who has received sevenfold becomes a conduit of divine generosity, a vessel through which others may encounter restoration, hope, and inspiration. Even in this transformative process, there remains an element of mystery. Human understanding will always struggle to perceive fully the scope of God's multiplication. There will be surprises, moments of wonder, and experiences that surpass all calculation. That is intentional. Sevenfold is designed not merely to restore, but to asto. Nish, to overwhelm, to remind the heart that God's ways are higher than our ways, that His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Every repayment contains within it a lesson: trust the unseen, believe in the impossible, and remain faithful in ways that defy human logic. And so, the call is clear. Continue in faith, continue in integrity, continue in hope. Do not become weary in the good you do, nor in the patience you exercise. Every act of fidelity is a seed, every moment of endurance a preparation. Even when the world scoffs, even when circumstances appear stagnant, even when the night seems endless, remember that God's multiplication is at work. Sevenfold is coming. It cannot be stopped, it cannot be diminished, it cannot be delayed beyond its appointed time. Your perseverance is honored, your faithfulness is seen, and your reward is already being fashioned with care, precision, and love beyond measure. The pattern emerges again and again through Scripture, through history, and rough the testimony of those who have walked long roads of waiting. The righteous suffer, the faithful endure, the patient persist, and then, at God's appointed moment, the multiplication arrives. Not just as a repayment, but as elevation, not merely as restoration, but as transformation. It reaches beyond the immediate to shape character, influence destiny, and extend blessing into generations. Sevenfold is not the end, it is the beginning of a new chapter, a new season, a new capacity for life fully aligned with divine purpose. And yet, as we reflect on the promise of sevenfold repayment, we must also consider the heart required to receive it fully. For it is not merely the circumstance of restoration that matters, but the posture of the soul. The heart must be open, humble, and expectant. Pride cannot hold abundance, doubt cannot multiply it, fear cannot nurture it. The one who anticipates God's repayment with trust, who does not negotiate, measure, or restrict it, is the one prepper, ready to embrace the fullness of what is coming. Sevenfold requires surrender, a quiet yielding to the divine orchestration that surpasses our reasoning. It is an act of faith not only to endure hardship, but to believe in the unseen hand that is turning every loss into opportunity, every delay into alignment, and every sorrow into a seed of multiplied joy. There is also a rhythm to God's multiplication, a timing so precise that it escapes the casual observer. The sevenfold often begins quietly, in ways almost imperceptible, but each small increase carries the momentum of a storm of blessing. Perhaps a favor appears in a conversation that once seemed ordinary. Perhaps an opportunity comes to you without effort, unearned by human calculation. Perhaps a recognition is given not for pride but for service faithfully rendered. These small beginnings are not coincidences, they are the early manifestations of the grand repayment. The universe begins to adjust in ways that align with the magnitude of what is coming. Doors that once seemed locked begin to open. People who seemed indifferent become allies. Resources that seemed scarce multiply. The invisible gears of providence are at work long before the manifestation becomes visible. And while the multiplication is God's to give, the response is ours to cultivate. Gratitude, humility, generosity, and obedience are the channels through which the blessing flows further. The heart that hoards or doubts, that measures or begrudges, limits the very overflow that God intends. The sevenfold is not an isolated gift, it is a covenant with responsibility. One cannot receive without also becoming a steward. The multiplied blessing carries with it an expectation to share, to lift, to inspire, to act as a conduit for others who have also endured. It is both a restoration and a commission. Moreover, the lessons embedded in the waiting period are crucial to understanding the nature of God's multiplication. Every trial, every setback, every delay was purposeful. They were shaping perception, refining desire, cultivating resilience, and building spiritual insight. Without these formative experiences, the heart cannot fully grasp or carry the magnitude of the repayment. We are transformed not by the arrival of abundance alone, but by the journey that prepares us to receive it without being overwhelmed, to use it wisely without squander, to carry it with integrity without corruption. Sevenfold is as much about transformation of character as it is about restoration of circumstance. And consider this, the sevenfold is often unexpected. God does not always repay according to human logic or schedule. He may choose to work through paths unseen, people unimagined, or moments unpredicted. This unpredictability is not chaos, it is divine creativity. It ensures that our trust rests on our ability to forecast or control, but on His faithfulness. The multiplication may appear in forms we never anticipated, in ways that defy our understanding, and yet it is perfectly suited to meet the fullness of our need and the expansion of our destiny. The blessing may come as opportunity where we once felt scarcity, as recognition where we once felt overlooked, as influence where we once felt powerless, as peace where we once felt turmoil. And all this is designed not to simply repay, but to elevate, to enlarge, and to empower. Even more, the sevenfold repayment often carries with it a sense of vindication, though not one rooted in revenge or bitterness. Vindication here is the alignment of truth, integrity, and justice in a manner visible to both the recipient and the witness. Those who once questioned, doubted, or undermined your journey become silent witnesses to the power of faith, endurance, and divine principle. The repayment is both restorative and revelatory, demonstrating that integrity is never wasted and that God's promises are never empty. And yet, this vindication is gentle. It does not seek to humiliate but to honor. It confirms what the faithful have always known, that the Creator never overlooks effort, love, patience, or righteousness. At the same time, there is a profound internal dimension to this process. The heart that has endured without bitterness, the mind that has sought wisdom rather than revenge, the spirit that has maintained hope even when circumstances were grim. These are the elements that prepare one for the fullness of sevenfold. The multiplication is never purely external. It transforms the inner landscape as well as the external reality. It replaces fear with confidence, despair with hope, weakness with strength, and confusion with clarity. It brings not only provision but peace. It restores not only position but perspective. It multiplies not only circumstances but capacity for joy, love, and purpose. And as we consider the larger implications, it becomes clear that God's sevenfold principle is designed to overflow into the lives of others. One who receives this abundance becomes a channel of blessing, a living testament that restoration is possible and that faithfulness is never in vain. Generosity becomes natural, influence becomes purposeful, and leadership becomes a reflection of divine character. The repayment is never selfish, it is communal. It touches not only the individual, but the family, the community, and even the generations that follow. What was once a personal trial becomes a legacy of hope, resilience, and divine faithfulness. There is also a spiritual clarity that emerges through this process. God's multiplication illuminates patterns that were invisible during times of waiting. Opportunities and relationships that once seemed random now appear purposeful. Challenges and losses that once seemed meaningless now reveal their formative role. The sevenfold repayment uncovers a narrative, divine orchestration, where every delay, every disappointment, every sacrifice served a precise role in shaping the person capable of receiving extraordinary blessing. In this clarity, gratitude deepens, awe expands, and trust solidifies. The heart recognizes that God is not only generous but intentional, not only faithful but wise, not only powerful but perfectly timed. And so the faithful are called to vigilance, not anxious calculation, to prayer, not panic, to obedience, not opportunism. The heart that is ready for multiplication does not question the methodology but embraces the reality. It does not measure by comparison with others, but delights in the appropriateness of God's timing and measure. It does not demand signs or prove outcomes, but remains steadfast in trust. The waiting, the endurance, the patience, all of these are necessary preparation for a blessing that cannot be contained by ordinary expectation. The sevenfold is never accidental. It is the result of careful preparation, alignment of spirit, and fidelity to principle. And yet, even as the promise nears fulfillment, humility remains essential. The one who receives sevenfold must recognize that the multiplication is not earned by human merit alone, but is a gift, a declaration of divine favor. Pride would corrupt the joy, narrow the vision, and limit the effectiveness of the blessing. Gratitude and stewardship are the twin responses that open the heart fully to receive and to deploy the abundance wisely. The multiplication, while vast, requires wisdom. The increase, while joyous, demands discernment. The restoration, while complete, calls for integrity. In this way, the sevenfold repayment is not merely about quantity, it is about maturity, responsibility, and transformation. And let us consider the broader context. Life is a tapestry woven with seasons of waiting, trial, and multiplication. The sevenfold is not an isolated principle, but part of a larger pattern of divine interaction with faithful. Loss is never final, delay is never permanent, and suffering is never wasted. Each hardship, each moment of silence, each perceived injustice serves a role in preparing the recipient for a blessing so abundant that human imagination cannot contain it. The multiplication restores, vindicates, elevates, transforms, and commissions. It is comprehensive, holistic, and eternal in its impact. In light of this, the call to faith becomes urgent yet tender. Do not allow the shadows of past loss to obscure the promise of multiplied restoration. Do not let impatience or doubt disqualify the heart from the fullness of what is coming. Do not allow fear, envy, or comparison to diminish the reception of divine generosity. The sevenfold is not partial, it is complete. It is not a transaction, it is a transformation. It is not merely about what was taken, but about what is being built, internally and externally, for the purposes of God's glory and the advancement of His kingdom on earth through the life that has remained faithful. And so, the faithful endure. They persevere. They maintain hope. They act with integrity. They love with patience. They walk with trust. And all the while, unseen and meticulous, God prepares the return, multiplying every seed sown in faith, every act of love given without expectation, every moment of obedience executed quietly, every sacrifice accepted without complaint. The multiplication cannot be hurried, cannot be diminished, cannot be diverted. It is precise, intentional, and overwhelming in its design. Those who have waited will witness not only restoration but expansion. Those who have hoped will receive not merely what they lost, but what they were never able to imagine. Those who have remained faithful will discover a capacity within themselves that matches the immensity of what has been promised. And this is the essence of sevenfold, not merely return, not merely compensation, not merely vindication, but a holistic, transformative, expansive multiplication that touches every aspect of life, material, relational, spiritual, emotional, and eternal. The loss that seemed permanent becomes temporary. The waiting that seemed endless becomes preparation. The endurance that seemed exhausting becomes the very ground on which blessing is built. And in this, the faithful recognize the profound truth: God's promises are not conditional upon our understanding, nor are His actions measured by human limitations. They are expressions of His nature, boundless in generosity, precise in timing, perfect in execution, and multiplying beyond comprehension. And so, dear friend, as we stand on the threshold of what God has promised, let us embrace this truth with unwavering confidence. Every trial you have endured, every moment of waiting, every act of faithful obedience has been seen, remembered, and multiplied in the heart of the Almighty. The sevenfold repayment is not a distant dream, it is a certainty already unfolding, transforming your past losses into abundant blessings, your patience into purpose, and your faith into triumph. Let your heart be steadfast, your hope unshakable, and your spirit ready to receive, for the God who has walked with you through the silence, who has strengthened you in the shadows, and who has never forgotten a single tear, is now preparing to restore, elevate, and multiply everything for your good. Step forward, not in fear or doubt, but in the quiet confidence that what was promised is on its way, that your life is about to overflow with blessings beyond measure, and that the God who promised it all is faithful to deliver sevenfold and more.